I'm looking forward to talking about GitHub Actions. This is something I've been talking about a lot for past couple of years. So with that being said, I do have links to actual beginner videos on my YouTube. I won't cover like the basics in this, but I'm going to cover specifically continuous delivery with GitHub Actions, and we'll get into that. But to set the stage up, GitHub Actions is a tool built by GitHub. You can use it today in any of your repositories, and it allows you to automate portions of your workflow, leveraging all these different types of primitives inside of GitHub, which we'll get into in a moment. But to sort of intro you, if you have not heard of it, GitHub Actions is available to you in your repositories using this tab right here, which is the Actions tab. Definitely check that out in any of your repositories. If you don't have an idea of what you want to automate, CI, running your test, is a good way to get started. So this is a Node.js application. I can actually add the Node.js GitHub Action workflow, and it's going to look like this. It will be some YAML. Again, I'm not going to go break this down into great detail, but just understand that this YAML will run your test on 4 different versions of Node using an Ubuntu image and a runner hosted in the cloud, GitHub's cloud. And I'll leave it at that because, again, I want to get to the other stuff. I don't want to just talk about the actual beginnings of GitHub Actions because I do have some of that content on the internet for you. But because I mentioned CI and I'm going to talk about CD, which is continuous delivery. CI and CD usually are things that just work. Like I think a lot of at this point, CI tools have been commoditized at a point where like you can leverage GitHub Actions, you can leverage Circle, you can leverage, I think you can still leverage Travis Jenkins. Jenkins and Travis are separate, but I didn't put a comma in that sentence. But what I'm getting at, there's a lot of tools you can use to run your test. And what I want to talk about is things you could do more, like the next step in addition to just running your test. So here's an example that I'll get into later in my talk. But this is a GitHub action that runs a Lighthouse score on your project at the pull request time. Now, this is something that was like, when I discovered this from one of my community members in open source, they pitched it on me to add to the project. I never run my Lighthouse score. Like Lighthouse score is something I do when there's a problem or do when I have some free time and I want to go and see if there's some accessibility concerns or performance concerns. So instead of me running this every time there's a problem, I run this at the time when there's a pull request. It seems trivial, but this is something that GitHub Actions is trying to do. It's like get you into a place where you can automate things using community created actions. So Jake Jarvis is somebody I've never met. I'm aware of. He built this action. It's open source in a GitHub repo. And now not only can I run this action on pull request, I can run this on my deploy previews on Netlify specifically. So every deploy preview from Netlify, you get a unique URL. And that URL can run and get a Lighthouse score. So instead of waiting until there's a problem in production, you can actually catch those problems at the time of pull requests. The other thing I like to do is automate my storybook deployment, which I'm actually doing an overhaul on. This is an old blog post from December of 2019. I'm going to be updating this because I have a PR open right now on open source. And but what I'm getting at is I wrote this blog post and I created my design system, but I wanted my design system to be deployed every time there were changes in my components. So just recently, a design system got an update. So even this screenshot is actually updated as of last week. We had a contributor go through and update all the components in open source. And I want this to be automated and redeployed every time there's a change in my React components or in my storybook stories. And I'm doing that through GitHub Actions, which I'll get into in a sec. But I should probably introduce GitHub at this point, which I'm going to make a lot of assumptions and that you've heard of GitHub. If you haven't heard of GitHub, congratulations. GitHub is a collaboration tool to not only host your source code and have version control, but also there's a lot of cool collaboration tools like project management, which we just shipped an update yesterday, actually, around project management. So definitely check that out and sign up for that beta. But if I could just summarize all that into collaboration at scale. So we saw firsthand in 2020 the opportunity to work from home. A lot of us who didn't work from home were working from home. And you could see why asynchronous programming, having comments and pull requests and things like that to get you out of the unstuck are all opportunities you can do on GitHub's platform. So not only that, we're home for code in the cloud, collaboration scale, but also open source too as well. There's a lot of examples that I'm going to go through that are all open source that you can build on top of, fork, clone, recreate, and as long as it's licensed and allowable, you can actually don't have to start from scratch. So I'll briefly talk about Home for Code in the Cloud because I did talk about collaboration at scale. GitHub is where the world builds software. At this point, we're 65 million developers worldwide. That's a great number. But I bring up that number because my role at GitHub is a developer advocate at GitHub. So I get to advocate for those 65 million developers. I was just in my email, actually, of all places. I don't do a lot of email at GitHub. Surprise, I do a lot of GitHub issues. So if you mention me on a GitHub issue, I will respond. Just use my GitHub handle right there. Let me know your problem, your issue, and I'll try to get back to you in a timely manner. I'm usually about 7 days with GitHub mentions, but I'm trying to get better on that with the mobile app. But what I'm getting at is I get to advocate for ideas, features, things that you want to see implemented in GitHub. Not always all the time we can actually just ship a feature for your use case, but I can talk to you how do you leverage the API to build that feature and have some sort of stopgap in between what you want to have and what you we could be building. One of my examples and also my GitHub profile is I recreated MySpace using my GitHub profile README, and so you can see all my top 8 friends on GitHub. I've built this using a GitHub action. So every time I open up an issue, I can add a new person to my top 8 just by adding their handle to the issue. It opens up a PR, generates a new README, but also adds them to a developer.yaml file. It's all automated. It's probably over automated. It's not really. I could just edit the README and replace names fairly manually, but I wanted to create a use case for bringing back MySpace to the GitHub profile. But the reason I have this here is because a year ago, a couple weeks ago, I sent out this tweet, and it was like post George Floyd and George Floyd Black Lives Matter, the protests, and y'all probably remember that. But anyway, I don't have to go super deep into that. But I sent out this tweet because I wanted to find out folks who are on GitHub who identify as Black, and they're doing open source. I wanted to sponsor them, and I got a really good response, so much that I actually made friends of all these people here. Most of them I did not know prior, so made friends with them, and I basically, the MySpace page was the what came after this. I actually built this before the MySpace page, and it's also built by GitHub Actions. So if you are a Black developer and you want to be part of my awesome Black developers list and my crew, feel free to open up issue, add yourself to there, and we'll get that PR merge. But what I wanted to bring up is that this is a GitHub action that I built with me and my coworker, Damon, and it's all built in Ruby. So a lot of the context around GitHub Actions today is around running tests, but I also wanted to point out you can write your own custom actions. So this is a Ruby script to essentially regenerate a README file. So we take the existing README file, we look at the developers.yaml file that is also sourcing all the developers, and then generating that README on the fly every time it gets an issue opened or I hit the manually publish button. This is powered by an internal local action too as well, which is runnable by a Docker file. So the one thing I just want to point out is that inside the actions folder, so up on the top, you can see /action/create README. I'm just taking that action folder and running it. And the way I'm doing it is because the Docker file has an entry point, and it's probably overly complicated, but just wanted to point out that I'm actually running code that I wrote internally in the repo that runs out a script and automates that. And that was like the goal for GitHub Actions when we launched it back in 2018, is we wanted to give a place where you could write any script of code inside your repository on demand or through automation. And then that way GitHub can just get out of the way. So if you're waiting on a feature for GitHub ship, or if you want some sort of automation that would work for your team, or you already built automation, you can run that on GitHub hosted runners. And we built it on the concept of GitHub primitives, which I had alluded to earlier. And the primitives of GitHub is the API, webhooks, authentication, and a couple other things. And all those primitives are things that I've previously worked at Netlify. It's something that I had to work with on a regular basis. So like that login with GitHub button on Netlify or any other tool, being able to select your repo to deploy. Like those are all the primitives that I had to sort of figure out through that process, and then also keep up and maintain that. And with GitHub Actions, we're providing workflow automation and a combination of those primitives inside of your repository. So everybody has access to this. I bring up this analogy all the time, probably bring it up too much around basketball. I'm a basketball fan, so shout out to the playoffs. my team's not in the playoffs. I'm from Florida, so my team was always Orlando Magic, but I've sort of fallen off following them since I moved to the West Coast. But what I'm getting at is there's this idea of full court layups. And if you are a programmer, maybe don't, well, programmers love basketball. It's a fact, right? But what I'm getting at is like, maybe you don't like basketball. Maybe you're not a true fan. There's an idea of full court layups, which essentially there's 5 people on the court, 5 people on the team, rather, 10 people on the court, 2 teams. And there's an opportunity for the person to take the ball in and then score a basket without ever using any of the rest of the team. And the concept of programming, you'd call this like a cowboy coder, like folks who sort of this like, everybody knows they're going to ship something really awesome and they can get anybody unstuck. And to the point, they're the person everybody looks to, sort of like the LeBron James on the team. And what I'm getting at is in the concept of basketball, they wrote a book called Hoopernomics. There's a concept called Hoopernomics. The book was called Sprawl Ball. And it was based on the concept of the book from Moneyball, applying statistics to sports. And they took every shot on the court and identified where on the court could you get the most shots, the most percentage shots go in. And they found out that there was one place on the court, which is called Area 31. And that meant 31% of the shots, they go in from this point on the court. So depending on how many right-handed players there are and how difficult it is to defend that close to the rim, as well as the arc of the shot, there's a lot of variables in the mix here, but basically, if you know that every shot that goes, 31% of the shots that go in from this point, then you can go ahead and automate your plays to emphasize getting the ball to that point on the court. So rather than take the ball directly from one end to the other end of the court as a solo player, you can now utilize the team. You can utilize sort of automating yourself into getting to that point on the court. This right here is a triangle offense. Is the offense that's played where no matter where you are or who's defending on you, you're always going to have someone to the left or to the right of you. So if you automate to the point where your plays or even your code to the point where you've seen this happen before, this goes back to like the idea of having written tests for your code. If you have tests or if you have automation set up where you're just sort of used to certain situations, you're able to get yourself unstuck faster and faster and faster, or make shots faster and faster and faster, which we're seeing right now in the playoffs. So what I'm getting at and why I'm sort of overemphasizing this basketball analogy, so apologies if you all just sort of closed your eyes and fell asleep. You should identify repetitive tasks and automate those. So repetitive tasks being like things like every time I open an issue, I want these 2 people to be assigned because those are my triage team members, those are my junior engineers, those are my senior engineers, whatever it is. I know that these are the folks that need to get to either labeled issues or get the issue unstuck or to triage it. So why not automate assigning those folks to issues? Now, in continuous integration, which I alluded to in the beginning, it basically starts in the concept, and like you can break this apart and create your own diagrams, but source control being Git or pushing to GitHub. That's like where a lot of this starts. And then the second step is usually always going to be emphasized on testing. So whether you're running linting or you're running test, that's where you sort of get your build to basically process, compile it or whatnot if you happen to be using TypeScript and etc. And then from that point, you can deploy that to staging. So I mentioned Netlify and deploy previews. You can deploy that to staging, have a URL, or if you want, for whatever reason, use GitHub Pages. It's a great feature. It's a great tool. You can leverage that. Obviously, quite a few other tools you can leverage too as well. But you can deploy your test environment, and then based on that review process and code review, then you can deploy to production. It's automated. Everybody knows the system. There's no one that's going to be unblocked. The only challenge is trying to get your coworkers to look at your code, I think, is the biggest challenge in that point. But going back to the idea of linting, we had built this tool called checks back in 2018. Checks being the way you sort of get more fine-grained, like expressive comments and error messages inside of your code based on the tools that you're building. So this is a super CI, which is a made-up example, but this basically is going to find out where your CSS is not working or is not linted properly, and give you some sort of nice error message to tell you what to replace that with. The cool thing about this is like now we can block on failures in the CI. I know there are folks that probably use Husky and other pre-commit hooks. I'm not a big fan of pre-commit hooks because they always get in the way. I also do a lot of open source, and whenever I find a pre-commit hook that just prevents me from even learning or getting past a certain situation. I find that very oppressive. I know that's a strong word, but I like doing this on the GitHub side or doing this on a nicer way inside the PR. So that's what CI checks can basically do for you, as opposed to doing a pre-commit hook. The way we did this at GitHub back in 2018, which is when we shipped a lot of these features, we made the decision to remove jQuery from the github.com site. And the way we did this is that we created these checks at PR time. If there was any jQuery in the PR, it would then present you with a JavaScript version. So it actually compile it down to JavaScript and say, okay, use this instead. And the reason for this is like jQuery is a great library, but JavaScript has advanced so much in the last couple of years that a lot of the features we were leveraging for jQuery were actually built into JavaScript at this point. So the decision was made to remove one more library from the front end UI. And that's how we did this, was through these checks, these expressive comments and annotations to be able to copy and paste, add to your code base. So it was no longer, I didn't touch this code, or I was just making a quick fix. I'm not going to change the jQuery out of there. It was more of like, there's no excuse. You have the code, just copy and paste it, put it in, and then at the test pass, we're all good. We're all happy. We're all good to go. And we were able to switch from jQuery to JavaScript in record time. So again, going to repetitive tasks, we all know we're going to review pull requests once a day. Hopefully you're reviewing them once a day. Your coworkers, your teammates, they want you to review their code. So if you know that's the case, why not set up some automation to sort of like have someone say, throw a Google, actually, this would be amazing if you built this, throw a Google Calendar invite for review time, or throw a Slack message or a Discord message or a Teams message, whatever you're using, into the Teams channel to say, hey, reminder, these are the actual open PRs. These are the folks who are blocking the review process. Like those are all things you can let their robots or the automation take over, so that way you don't have to continually have to be struggling through like trying to figure out when you're going to find time to review these PRs or get the stuff shipped. So moving along to basically the final section, which is going to be just actions examples. This is all sort of thought leadership, pie in the sky, talking through process. These are actually going to be some options and things for you to sort of think about when you think about a continuous delivery. Now, I just did a Twitch stream, twitch.tv/GitHub every Friday, including this Friday. I do an interview series with a open source maintainer to talk about how they manage their projects on GitHub. It's really for my benefit. I'm super intrigued on how people approach open source. And so I meet with my friends and people who eventually become my friends to chat about open source. And in one of these sessions, I met with Gregor. Gregor is a maintainer of OctaKit, and he's been maintaining OctaKit for quite some time. Actually, not even on OctaKit. OctaKit is a couple different libraries, Ruby and .NET. The JavaScript version one, he's the one, he maintains that. And what I found out is it's 25 plus repositories. Now, for someone to maintain 25 plus repositories, he does get help, but also it takes a bit of effort in managing it. So he leverages GitHub projects to be able to set up his project in a way where it's essentially email, where all issues that get opened up get thrown into the inbox. And inside this inbox, he just opened up the project board and he's able to triage and say, okay, well, this is a support issue, this is a maintenance issue, this is something that could be a feature. He actually labels them uses automation to label them and then have them proceed to specific columns. And this is something that he's built with the GitHub app, which is a little more intense version of a GitHub Action. GitHub Action is a nice little introduction. But he's also leveraging things like Semver releases to be able to add the Semver tags to his PR comments to also automate where those releases go. So is this going to bump the minor versions, the major versions? This is all decided through the automation and the OctaKit bot too as well. So this kind of really opened up the entire, and this is the conversation I had with him a year ago, opened up the entire door of like opportunity for automation. That's where these examples are coming from. So one example that I do all the time now, I've never done this before. I never generated my own release notes for my own projects. But what I found is that if I don't do this, whenever I get somebody to come to contribute to my project, they're always either lost or have tons of questions. And now I'm in a point where I'm just like writing documentation on open source and writing releases every time I ship features. So that way no one has to ask me like 100 questions on how this project got to where it is today. They can just go to the release notes. And what's cool about this is that Release Drafters are an awesome tool, which is a GitHub action that will automate the drafting of your releases. So this is a marketplace listing. Marketplace is a place where you can find GitHub integrations. So if it's a tool that you want to leverage an idea, you can always search marketplace before building it if you'd like, or you can, because they're open source, you can fork and clone and get a head start too as well. But always remember attribution if the license sets. So this is what the releases look like. This is a project we built late last year called Skyline. And this is our releases. These were all generated releases. So every time you push a commit, it actually automates itself putting the bullet point of what the release looks like. And this is what open source releases look like. So I have got my changes up on top where I've got my bug fixes and then the one feature where, well, technically that wasn't a feature, that was a fix because it was migrating the latest version, but that's neither here or there. What I'm getting at is all those bullet points were not added by me. All those bullet points that link to pull request, they were added by the release drafter. And I've also taken the point of sorting out Dependabot commits and pull request merge separately. So that way it's very clear. I can basically be able to filter this and say, okay, these are humans up on top, and the Dependabot had a great release. They're all on the bottom. And this is all powered by that one tool as well. So definitely check it out if you're interested in how to automate your release notes. Now, this is kind of the heart of this whole continuous deployment idea too, as well as the idea of managing different environments on the GitHub level. This is, as I mentioned before, this is skyline.github.com. My coworker is going to type in their name. This is the demo they created for a previous conference. And it's going to generate a WebGL. So this is actually the website. Nothing to do with GitHub Actions, but the website itself is skyline.github.com. Plug, always be plugging. But that's basically what the site is. In order to leverage different environments, you can go into your settings tab in GitHub, scroll down to environments. And this, you can actually set up deployment specifically for staging, for production, for staging 2, directly inside of your GitHub Action workflow and I guess I was going to say pipeline, but that's a whole nother product on another company. But what I'm getting at is you can set secrets. You can also set reviews. So if you want to protect different staging environments based on only these 2 engineers can approve the staging environment, or maybe a QA team can approve the staging environment to be released to be deployed. You can also set that up as well. And then what's cool about this is we have a workflow visualizer. So if you want to visualize exactly what's happening, this is also built in Actions. So if I clicked into my action that is deploying, well, actually my release action, this is anyway, I'm stumbling over there because actually I realized that this, the way the deploys happen in Skyline is that whenever you cut a release, that's when it deploys, which is a little different than like things like Netlify where you deploy on pull request. But besides the fact, moving along, I can actually get the URLs to basically be appended to the visualizer inside the actual action workflow. And then I can also click through and see if the staging environment, if it looks good to go. So I'll spare the details here. It's going to be literally the same thing, typing in, seeing the WebGL work. At that point, we can go and review the deployments because we have a protected branch. And then, so anybody in this team, which is the OctoKit dev, the Octo Academy, which is a made up team for this example, is going to approve that, and it's going to have that proceed to production. So I think it's great. And hopefully this is sparking some interest in other folks to leverage this continuous delivery ideas. Now, I mentioned in the beginning, and I won't go into a ton of detail, but GitHub Actions is powered by YAML files. So the specific deploy to staging step inside of the GitHub Action workflow, this is it. And the way I'm doing this is about actually only whenever there's a PR that's opened up on the main branch, it's going to trigger the deploy to staging workflow. This one in particular, we're actually deploying to Azure. And I can set up my Azure secrets. As I mentioned before, you can set up secrets based on staging environments. And I'm also leveraging the open source Azure Web Apps Deploy GitHub Action. So if you look to the last section where it says name deploy popular repos, you can also see that uses Azure/Web Apps Deploy/v2. Azure is the org, Web Apps Deploy is the repo name, and v2 is the actual tag. So anything that's within the v2 tag, it's going to be leveraged inside my workflow as well. again, this is all context I do have in YouTube videos intentionally, because to go through all this detail would be more of a workshop than a actual talk. But I did want to talk about how open source, how I've leveraged the same sort of pattern in one of my projects called Slaybot. Now, Slaybot is a Twitch interaction. I do a lot of Twitch streaming. And what I do is I built these little interactions for folks to come into my chat and type in one-off commands to basically either say hello or to have me switch my screen, because sometimes I forget to switch the screen so where you can actually see it. So that's what that is. I also deploy this to Azure as well. And the reason I do that is really because I needed something close to Metal or the cloud to basically build my staging environments. You could replace this with render.com or AWS or whatever you'd prefer. But this is open source. So if you want to fork and clone and look at the action workflows, you can actually see exactly what I'm doing. I also mentioned always be plugging. BWO is where I live stream. But this is my workflow visualizer. So it's a little different from the Skyline one, because I wanted to emulate something closer to what Netlify does, but for node-based server webhooked powered apps. So I wanted to basically have a deploy preview, the same sort of pattern for my Slaybot. And this is what I'm doing. I have a GitHub Action workflow that creates a staging environment whenever a pull request is opened. And I do this intentionally because a lot of times when I'm live on stream, there's an idea for a feature to the Slaybot that I'll just build real quick, and I'll open up a pull request and then have a staging URL or staging server to be able to test that live while I have an audience. So it's a lot of fun. This is my visualizer. I also do release notes, as I mentioned before. I have a whole thing to basically keep people up to date on what's changed, because a lot of stuff changes pretty fast over there. I'm also leveraging this environment tab too as well, which I didn't mention before, but because I created an environment called staging, I can have that staging URL that comes back from the GitHub Action. So the web app deploys action actually gives me the URL from Azure directly. So there's a lot of sort of pointing, basically hot wiring to basically get my URL back. This is all open source and powered by the Azure team. They give that to me for free. And that's how I'm making this work, which is essentially do deploy previews inline inside of my pull request. So it's a feature I loved at Netlify, and I still use it at Netlify today. But in this case, I needed to use Azure for it. So I just rebuilt that one idea of giving me my URL inside my PR. So there it is. And the way I'm doing comments, so this is actually a PR comment from GitHub Actions displaying that. The way I'm doing that is through GitHub Script. And GitHub Script is another action powered by the Actions team. So if you look on line 3, Actions/GitHub Script, that is give me the ability to write JavaScript inside of my YAML. And the reason this is not a great experience, to be quite honest, it's more of like a hacky solution built by an Actions team member for like a hack day. I love this because what I do with this is I prototype ideas like this before I go and open source and build something. So I've basically prototyped how to get comments written onto my PRs based on Action webhooks events. And that's what I'm doing right here. And yeah, I'm a big fan of that. I'll probably end up eventually making this in a full-blown action that anybody can download and use on their own. But also I want to move on to another example, which is uploading artifacts. Because I'm deploying to Azure, which is using this repository. If you've done anything with AWS or Azure, like whenever you deploy a web app, you've got to basically zip it and then upload it up into the cloud. That's why I love tools like Vercel and Netlify, because they do this for you. But because I have to basically bundle that into a zip file, I do that using artifacts. So I'm actually uploading it to my GitHub repo, my Action runner. It's going to have the full version of my Node app. Uploaded right there. It's 12 megabytes. Again, I'm not great at the whole Lighthouse score thing and keeping stuff small and minified, but there you have it, 12 megabytes. It's huge. The way I'm doing that and I'm building that is I'm basically this npm installing. I'm caching my node modules. So the cool thing about Actions and using the Action cache action is that I can cache my node modules so I can speed up my build process. So maybe I can get my build smaller, but at least I can make it faster using cache. And the majority of this is self-explanatory. So apologize it isn't. I'm happy to answer questions. But the last step, so I failed to mention this, and I should probably, if I give this talk again, I should really preface a lot of the intro stuff. I've had to delete it for time. But what I'm getting at is with Actions, you can have 20 asynchronous jobs running at the same time. So if I want to run a build to upload my stuff to Azure, but also write a script to create a comment, but also, do a thing to notify someone in Slack, I could do 20 of those actions or those action workflows at a time. When I say workflow, what I really mean is jobs. Jobs are multiple jobs inside of a workflow. Man, I'm really stumbling. I'm like thinking I should probably do more of an intro in this, but I'm also realizing I do have some time for questions. So I'll allude to questions if you have some more questions on this, or I'll point you to my YouTube videos. But what I'm getting at is you get 20 jobs. Inside those jobs, you have asynchronous steps. So that step command on the top, those are synchronous. So they have to be one after the other. But jobs can run asynchronously. So this job right here is uploading it directly to the action workflow. That's what the upload artifact action. Also pointing out every single one of these steps I'm using in a third-party action. So I started this whole thing off with how I can run code locally with my MySpace page. These are all code that's hosted on GitHub that I'm just pulling down. Finally, the deploy is something that I just want to mention as well. This is on pull requests. Also, I mentioned this before in a previous thing, but this is actually specifically the Slaybot example. Also open source, so check it out if you want to get a closer look. Another idea that I had, which is compressing images for the web. This is something that I just searched on Marketplace. I looked for image actions. I wanted to recreate something similar that Netlify, and I mentioned Netlify. I used to work for them. I mentioned that already, but this is a one-click option inside Netlify is compressing images. There's a company that built that similar experience as a GitHub Action. And it really comes down to, this is a site I built specifically for my live streaming and while I was live streaming. And it just gives examples of what I'm working on while I'm live streaming. And I don't do anything as far as compressing images manually. Like I just sort of throw images up there. Here's an example. Here's a picture. I'm leveraging that action to basically make myself do a better job. So this is what it looks like. This is me using the Caliber Up action here, closer towards the middle, towards the bottom. And this is what it looks like. It actually presents a comment of all the saving of my images. And again, it's mainly because I'm a lazy programmer and I do a bunch of stuff. So why not just use an action to compress that for me? There's probably a better use case for this and more optimization, but there's my example. Also, really quick, I just want to point out the fact that you can do self-hosted runners. So if you are a DevOps whiz, or if you want to leverage your own cloud environments or local host, you can do cloud hosted runners. It is a setting inside of the Actions tab of your repository, and it gives you the opportunity to run the runner and then point that to your GitHub Action workflow. So if you want to do some more helpful debugging or get more closer to what's actually happening, you can do that using that experience. Definitely check out the documentation. Speaking of which, this is a GitHub repo of using GitHub Action runners with Kubernetes. So if you wanted to, every time you open up a pull request, spin up a new Kubernetes cluster in AWS, which is what this example is, those green squares are eventually going to go off and on based on what PRs get open and what PRs get merged and closed. That's an example. I can't go into detail right now, but just know that you can do some Kubernetes and some clever stuff with GitHub Action runners as well. Also, this repo called Awesome Runners is another one that you could leverage for other examples just like that. So check it out. I did mention GitHub script, but I mentioned it kind of more detail than I probably should have. So I'm going to skip through this and just mention that this entire website was powered by GitHub scripts. I was sort of prototyping GitHub Actions as we were getting GitHub Action hackathon submissions, which is a GitHub Action hackathon. There's a lot of actions. It's actions all the way down, to be quite honest. But it was powered by a GitHub repo. And thanks to GitHub script, we could essentially take any submission that was basically a PR to a JSON file, and then we would add a label using that one script, those 5 lines of JavaScript up there, to be able to merge those PRs as well. And if it was a featured label, we basically get it on the homepage of the hackathon, and that's how that works. So rounding out the last couple slides and sort of reiterating continuous delivery and how I started, storybook deployments, the way I'm doing this, sort of the bread and butter is line 5. I can actually look at specific paths inside of my GitHub repo or inside my code base. And anytime I have a component that's changed, because this is a React app, or storybook file, which is the stories, it's going to deploy a new version to using the GitHub Pages deploy action. Now, GitHub Pages deploy action is it's named specifically for GitHub Pages, but I'm actually using this for Netlify, where Netlify is watching storybook static, that branch, and then deploying that folder to Netlify. So that's how I know Netlify has like a mono repo feature, but this actually fit better for my use case because I only need this deploy only when that repo or that branch gets updated. So I'm actually leveraging GitHub to do a mono repo deploys, but instead I'm deploying specifically to a branch. I could explain this better. I have an entire video series on this that I haven't published yet. So I won't continue to explain that poorly, but essentially I'm just doing some really clever things. And same thing with my docs site. In the future, I'll have docs.opensource.pizza OpenSauce.pizza that will deploy to the docs static branch. And I'm just running my build command with GitHub Actions, which is, again, it's me rebuilding Netlify features from the ground up using GitHub Actions. And then reminder, that's what it looks like. Also, really quick in passing, the Jake Jarvis action, it does give you inline accessibility and performance scores. So this is something that's attached to my action runner, my pull request. So every time I go back to try to find out, hey, what happened to our performance 2 PRs ago, we can just always go back to that PR, click on the action tab, look at the logs, and then see, oh, wow, this was a PR that basically broke everything. Maybe the test passed, but the performance went down. You could also do what I did with the comments, which I haven't done yet. I should really do this. Take those comments, this actual performance score, and whenever the performance goes down, write a comment on the PR using a GitHub script, or perhaps use a third-party action as well. So these are just like ideas, examples to hopefully expand your exposure to actions. As mentioned, I do have a YouTube channel, youtube.com/bduggy. Like and subscribe if you are willing. And I have GitHub Action tips and tricks on debugging, on running dependent jobs, which I didn't go into in very much detail. But hopefully this has sparked your interest and to hopefully try GitHub Action. So at this point, we have roughly 15 minutes for questions. I am a Beyonce advocate at GitHub, and yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thanks, Brian. I think we were just waiting for other Brian to come back. His internet's a bit flaky and we're kind of relying on him for the production here. I think the alligators in Florida must have chewed through the line or something. But yeah, thanks so much for that talk. And anything I think that can relieve the friction for developers is definitely a plus, especially like you say, you should be reviewing your pull requests in a timely fashion, especially in a production environment. But also if you're an open source maintainer, because you really want folks to contribute in a meaningful way. But if one of the things that I first look at when I go to contribute to open source is to see how many open pull requests they've got and when was the last time they merged anything. Because if they haven't been doing that, then I'm kind of not feeling like I'm valued. So yeah you can automate some of that, and anything that you can do to reduce the cognitive load, I think is really good. And you mentioned there the GitHub profiles, and when that first came out last year, I was all over that, and I made mine. I'm a bit old for the MySpace reference. I was going to totally skip that because I'm too old, but I was all over that, and I know there's loads more that I can do with that. I just haven't gotten around to it. So we did have a couple of questions in the chat. I think you just explained everything so well that folks didn't have too many questions. But somebody's asked if you've got any idea when we might see GitHub Actions support for self-hosted runners on the Apple M1 ARM.
Yeah, everybody's waiting for that. Yeah, I mean, that's honestly, it's on Apple. I don't know if anybody's done any sort of infrastructure work with Apple equipment. But the reality is, like, before the M1 chips, you literally had trash can MacBook Pros inside a server, because there's no server based Apple hardware. So I can only speculate because it's like, again, this is not a GitHub thing, because we'd have to like literally have Mac Minis inside some warehouse somewhere, in various places across the world. My only speculation is that Apple one day will actually provide proper infrastructure equipment and cloud hosted equipment stuff. So when that happens, you'll see it on GitHub, you'll see it in Azure, you'll see it in AWS, you'll see it in all other places. But at the moment, the reality is that you actually have to have physical Mac Minis or Mac, whatever you call them, Mac Pros, to be in some sort of warehouse. So that's the limitation.
Yeah, I think, like you say, everybody really wants to know about that, don't they? A few people in the chat were saying that they really love GitHub projects as well. I am a big fan of anything Kanban, and I usually use Trello. I always forget GitHub projects is there. But one of my favorite things about GitHub is that you can mention your issue and stuff, and it's just seamless. It's lovely. You don't have to remember to do all this stuff, and it's just it makes everything look really slick on your end. And a few people in the chat as well have got their own personal websites of GitHub pages. And what they're going to do is they're going to go away and explore how to, when they do a new blog post, how to make that automatically appear in their GitHub profiles. So that's definitely something I'm going to check out too. So the last question we've got, unless folks have got any other questions they quickly want to post in, is do you know if there are any costs involved with the compute time taken to run actions?
Yeah, so Actions for like a free account is 2,000 minutes, which is available to every GitHub user. So each account gets 2,000 minutes, and that's an organization wide. So based on all your repositories that are running Actions, you get 2,000 minutes to use per month for free. If you're a paid customer, it's 3,000 minutes. If you're part of a team, it goes up to, I think, the 10,000. So that the actual team organization, and honestly, I should probably know that number offhand because I was just looking at yesterday. I don't know. I can't remember if it's actually 10,000 or higher. But there is a limitation on minutes. For the most part, I think as a solo user, 2,000 minutes is pretty. It's pretty high. There are ways to basically optimize your actions so that way you're not actually using minutes where you're not supposed to be using minutes. So, for example, if your build time is taking 30 minutes every time you want to run your project, that's going to add up really fast, really quick, especially if you're doing actual development. So you should definitely keep in mind like how you can get your build times. I alluded to the fact that my Node app was 12 megabytes. I could optimize that by making that smaller and making sure that my build's not taking longer. That build itself was only 30 seconds. So, and I don't build that app very often, to be quite honest. So with all those sort of notions, like 2,000 minutes is the number you should keep in mind. You can check in the Actions tab to see if or in your Settings tab to see if you exceeded that as well.
Cool. Yeah, the person who asked that question has come back in the chat and said 2,000 seems really generous, and they said thanks for that. And one other great point that they made as well, because this is one of the folks that's got a GitHub Pages site for their personal portfolio, is the compressing images piece. This is something they always have to remember to do manually. They've got to go somewhere else and compress their image. So yeah, they're definitely going to check that out too. So that was all the questions. I know you spoke about open source.pizza. I'm still hungry for pizza.
Yeah.
And your YouTube channel. Was there anything else you wanted to promote? Any upcoming speaking engagements or anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, next week I'll be building an action live with Jason Langsdorff on Learning with Jason. So I believe it's next Thursday. So I'm looking forward to that. So if anybody wants to see the process of building it, definitely check that out. Keep an eye on the GitHub YouTube channel too as well. I do have a video series that's going to come out on this topic. I've had to actually re-record it because things have changed. We've actually shipped a lot of features. I didn't go into like a lot of folks have questions around Dependabot and how to get Actions to run on that. Actions has, because it's a generous 2,000 minutes, we do have a lot of security things that we have to combat in the open source world. So there has been some changes in how permissions work. So by default, Dependabot does not have access to your actions or your environment. You have to opt it in, and by doing that, you just generate a personal access token in your developer settings to make that work. But those are like hurdles that people usually find pretty quickly. So just mentioning that the GitHub token the authentication. So I mentioned primitives and passing, but I didn't break down what that meant when it came to authentication. GitHub Actions gives you authenticated workflows using a GitHub token provided that has read access only. There's challenge. This is where I'm going to go into detail next week with Jason about running GitHub Actions on forks and open source pull request. There's going to be some caveats to how you approach that. So definitely check that out next week.
Cool. Are you streaming with Jason on Twitch or?
It'll be on Twitch.
Okay.
Yeah, twitch.tv/learn with Jason.
Brilliant. Okay. And so they can either go on Twitch or they can also subscribe to the GitHub channel on YouTube.
Yeah, subscribe to the GitHub channel on YouTube, and we'll hopefully have that in the video series in the next couple weeks up there.
Brilliant.